Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the Academy. I'm delighted to welcome you for tonight's Richard C. Holbrooke lecture entitled Populism in an Age of Depopulation. And before I formally introduce our speaker, I'd just like to say a word or two about the Holbrooke Fellowship. And to do so, I have to give you a little history. Shortly after his untimely death, Richard Holbrooke was honored posthumously by the Academy with the establishment in 2013 of the Richard C. Holbrooke Forum. Richard was, of course, the founder of the Academy, the man who had the idea, and the forum was meant to create an institution that would always each year renew his effort to examine how you could apply the tools of diplomacy and statecraft to solve some of the world's most intractable problems. And the program has always brought together some of the most influential thinkers and practitioners in global affairs to engage in candid and far-reaching and deep drilling discussions about really the foremost issues of the day. And this has really been at the heart of the Academy's mission now for more than 25 years. The Richard C. Holbrooke Fellowship was inaugurated in 2018, and that was a bit of a shift. We now had a residency fellowship, a named fellow here at the Academy, who would essentially undertake to do a conference, a workshop on those issues that he or she was working on, and bring together leaders from government, from the business world, from academia, and inevitably we have picked someone whose research was focused in exactly those areas that we felt most urgently needed to be examined. And I want to thank the donors, and there are many of them, to the Richard C. Holbrooke Forum for their support in making this program possible. I should just mention that our recent Holbrooke Fellows included Anne-Marie Slaughter and Andy Moravchik, who fittingly, as a married couple, were co-fellows. Elizabeth Economy, George Frampton, one of the pioneering policymakers in the area of climate, and most recently Michael Kimmage, who was an extraordinary fellow last year in terms of the amount of outward engagement he did on his work on Ukraine and Russia. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our 2026 Holbrooke Fellow, Stephen Holmes. Stephen is the Walter E. Meyer Professor of Law at NYU Law School and faculty co-director of the Center on Law and Security. So as the president of the Academy, I have found repeatedly that there is one moment when I feel good, I feel reassured that the next class will not be a dud. I know that's kind of a weird confession, but it's true. And that moment came when Stephen emailed me and said, "Hey, I think I'd like to come back to Berlin and and apply for a fellowship." And immediately I thought, okay, we're going to be okay. It's going to be another good year, no matter who else is in the class. As it happens, the rest of the class turned out to be pretty good too. But I have known Stephen for a little more than 20 years now. And first of all, I knew him even before that because I knew him from his copious, really incredibly prolific writings in the New Republic, in the London Review of Books, the New York Review of Books, and elsewhere. And I knew him as one of America's really outstanding public intellectuals. But I also knew him as someone who had invited me, and I was hugely flattered to be invited to, the conference of conferences, as far as I was concerned. It was in the early years after 9/11, Stephen, in his capacity at the Center on Law and Security, was convening this terrific conference on political extremism, radical Islam, all these associated subjects. And unlike a dingy, conference room in, the Research Triangle or something, this was at NYU's fabulous villa in Florence. And there was something unreal about chomping on big chunks of really good Parmesan and drinking Prosecco in lemon groves and talking about, what had this or that Islamic theologian said in the 13th century. What was Ibn Taymiyyah thinking back then while drinking this Prosecco? It was a truly great conference, and I was honored to be there, and I was grateful to Stephen. So I have all kinds of warm associations when I think of Stephen Holmes. There's actually even a connection with the Academy, because out of those conferences, I came up with the project that I did at the Academy when I was a fellow, and I even named it after that villa, La Pietra. It was the La Pietra Project, and it was about creating a multilateral organization to deal with best practices and raise norms of behavior in counterterrorism. I presented that, I think, in 2003 or 4. I worked on it here, and I ultimately created that in 2010, I think, in Washington. And the Trump administration just withdrew from it a few months ago. So things go around, they come around. Anyway, enough about me. Let's talk about Stephen. Before he holds degrees from Denison, where he was an undergrad. He has an MA, MPhil, and PhD from Yale. Before joining NYU in 2000, he taught at Harvard, at the University of Chicago, where he was a tenured professor of political science and law, and he was also a professor of politics at Princeton. He really managed to avoid any of the dud schools, didn't have to. Well, we won't go any further. He specializes in the history and recent evolution of liberalism and anti-liberalism in Europe. He has been toiling in these fields for quite some time. His second book, I believe, was The Anatomy of Illiberalism. And anyway, he's been looking at liberalism, democracy, economic liberalization after communism, and many other related issues, including combating international terrorism within the bounds of the Constitution and the rule of law. He's a little like, in political science, what Anne Shukut was the other night in public health, and having every honor you can imagine. He's been awarded numerous fellowships, including from Carnegie, the Carnegie Endowment, correct? Okay, the National Council for Soviet and Eastern European Research, the Guggenheim Foundation, Fulbright, and Mellon Foundations. He is no stranger to Berlin. He was at the Wissenschaftskolleg in 91, 92. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Council on Foreign Relations. His most recent book, The Light That Failed, A Reckoning, was co-authored with that brilliant European Viennese-based intellectual Ivan Krastev, and published in 2020. And it argues that the rise of populist xenophobia, especially in Eastern Europe, but throughout the continent, stems from resentment towards the post-1989 pressure to adopt Western models and values. He's also the author of The Matador's Cape, America's Reckless Response to Terror, The Cost of Rights, Why Liberty Depends on Taxes, with Cass Sunstein, and numerous other works. And if you don't regularly see his essays in Project Syndicate, I recommend you do. He publishes widely, including in Foreign Policy, The Guardian, the London Review of Books, and of course in Project Syndicate. A quick roadmap to tonight. He will lecture for about 35 minutes, and then we will join together on the stage for a brief conversation, and then open it up to the audience for Q&A. And if you are with us, raise your hand and wait for the mic. And if you are joining us virtually, please type in your question in the Q&A box below. And I want to welcome Stephen to the stage, but first I have to do this. I'll let you do the fine tuning, okay? Thank you, Steve.
Whoops. That's the microphone. Well, hi, everybody. And thank you, Dan. It's been so great to be here. And like my fellow classmates, because we're a class, which is why we feel so young. We don't usually have breakfast with our colleagues back home, but here we do. And it's been a fantastic time. And we all are having pre-nostalgia because it's almost over. Okay, so the numbers came in just a few days ago. Germany recorded about 655,000 live births in 2025. That's the lowest figure since 1946. More than 1 million Germans died last year. That's a deficit of 350,000, which is another record. The total fertility rate in Germany is now 1.35, which of course is much lower than the 2.1 required to maintain a stable population. And it's impossible to remedy by policy because it's due to the small 1990s birth cohort entering their early 30s today. Now, numbers like these have a curious quality, which is that they're both routine and apocalyptic. German fertility rate's been below replacement levels since the early 70s, so it keeps arriving. It seems to be normal, but it has a flavor or a feeling of catastrophe around it. The background feeling of this impending doom, of course, is not really particularly German or especially German. Of course, it's global. We all know that this is one of the major facts about the world today, that fertility rates are falling everywhere in the world except sub-Saharan Africa. We know the standard list approximate causes for this depopulation trend: late entry into a stable employment, the cost of housing, the cost of private childcare, the gendered burden of childbearing, contraception, of course, environmental anxiety. That's the familiar litany. But I'm not a demographer, of course, and I'm not going to talk so much about demography itself, but rather about demographic panic, about the way that across Europe, America, and beyond, demographic decline has been interpreted politically, has been seen, and how the political reaction to demographic contraction has organized itself not around pensions and elder care and labor shortages and the redesign of social insurance, but around the rise of anti-immigrant parties whose central animating conviction is that a hidden elite is deliberately importing foreigners in order to erase a historical people, the great replacement theory. Low birth rates are no longer just a problem in this viewpoint. For finance ministers, they become the raw material for a politics that imagines peoples, civilizations, and ways of life on the brink of erasure. Now, my project at the Academy this semester is a sequel to my book with Ivan Krastev, The Light That Failed, and we call it tentatively titled After the Future. And the central claim is that the serial catastrophes that are now crowding our horizon, the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, the grotesque derangement of the American presidency, the unraveling of the Atlantic Alliance, and of course, my topic now, the rise of nativist parties, anti-establishment, ultimately anti-democratic and authoritarian parties in Europe and in the United States. These many catastrophes are not, we argue, they're not separate emergencies, but they're symptoms of a single, still unnamed condition. And that condition we're calling the foreclosure of the future, the waning capacity of any image of a better life to organize a politics that is increasingly conducted without a future tense, without a credible goal of collective action, without a forward-looking vision capable of inspiring sacrifice or justifying patience. Democratic politics in such a setting becomes the management of grievance often, or it has to deal with parties who are organized around the management of grievance, the consumption of resentment, the demolition of inherited institutions, whose upkeep no longer feels worth the trouble. Birth rates belong inside this picture of a foreclosed future because reproduction is among the most concrete bets a society places on its own continuation. To have a child is, among other things, to wager on a future which that child in which that child will have a place. The decision is not, of course, up to forecasts about GDP or so forth, but it's a decision that in the aggregate registers something about whether a future is felt to be safely habitable. It's striking that in the same democratic publics that are not having children, are not reproducing, you find the publics that are most receptive to political projects that frame the future as a theft, as foreclosed, as having been stolen, as being subject to replacement or extinction. Revealingly, and quite amazingly, actually, when you think about this development, is visible not only in the fringes, along the fringes of European politics, but in the strategic doctrine of the United States. The national security strategy of the second Trump administration, released in December, devotes a remarkable section to Europe, which I'm sure many of you know, maybe all of you know. The main threat posed by Europe to American national security is, of course, the suppression of free speech. We know that. The refusal to let parties like the AfD into government. But most of all, the real and stark prospect of civilizational erasure. That's the word our national security document says. The engines of that erasure are migration policies, cratering birth rates, the loss of national identity. Within a few decades, at the latest, certain NATO members will become majority non-European. Quote, should present trends continue, the continent will be unrecognizable in 20 years or less. In other words, a theory that a few years ago circulated on the margins of the European far right and that motivated the gunmen of Christchurch, El Paso, Buffalo, Pittsburgh, Halle, Hanau, has been adopted as the official strategic lens through which the United States now views its allies. Having traveled from the manifesto to the rifle, the great replacement has now arrived in the Situation Room. And Carl Bildt said this, I think, very clearly. He wasn't really exaggerating. It places Washington, quote, to the right of the extreme right in Europe. The main object of security has shifted from physical safety to civilizational continuity, and demographic panic, because, of course, what they're observing about Europe is true of the US as well, has been installed as the operating system of American foreign policy. You know, when the Department of Homeland Security was created after 9/11, it was focused naturally on Islamic terrorism. But in the first Trump administration, it became basically a border security policy. It's like as if security, the main threat to American security was not terrorism, but was immigration. All of us today live in the company of extinction fears of various kinds. There are 5 of them, and I'm going to talk about them now in order to, when we list all of the extinction fears with which we're surrounded, it's going to be easier to appreciate how mysterious it is that demographic replacement has acquired the particular political force it has. The first fear is ecological. The climate's changing, and not gently. Glaciers retreat, oceans rise, agricultural belts shift, species disappear at a rate associated with mass extinction. The habitability of the planet is in question. First, climate. Second, biological. The pandemic of 2020 reminded a generation accustomed to forgetting that infectious disease had not been eliminated and it was only briefly suppressed. In a few months, the virus shut down borders, overwhelmed hospitals, reordered everyday life. It almost woke for an instant that an older anxiety that goes back millennia, really, that contagious disease is not merely a public health emergency, but a force that can threaten the survival of societies. So there's climate, there's pandemic. The third is geopolitical. Nuclear weapons exist in numbers sufficient to end civilized life, of course, many times over. It's easy to imagine a chain of miscalculations in which a regional conflict escalates into something more destructive. Putin's very reckless saber rattling when he talks as if this is something that would be conceivable. We know that there are moments when there's a fear that a flight of geese is really incoming missiles. People have to make a decision in a few minutes. And when you have the leader of Russia acting as if he could use nuclear weapons, it's very, very destabilizing. And also, since 2022, Russian state television, you probably know, has periodically broadcast a graph showing the flight time of a nuclear Iskander missile from Kaliningrad to the Wannsee. It takes 106 seconds. A number like that is not strategic disclosure. It's a domestic theater, of course, to some extent. It's performed for a Russian audience as assurance that the country, which can't reproduce itself, by the way, can still at least reach the capitals of those whom the broadcasters, who in the broadcasters telling are replacing them. But still, it's disturbing. The fourth existential threat is technological. Robotics, this is also about replacement in this case. We're getting into a fear of being replaced. Robotics threaten manual labor. Artificial intelligence threaten professional work. And together they risk turning us into passengers in systems we no longer control, objects of opaque algorithms rather than subjects of self-government. The fifth, and that's our topic, is that the demographic contraction of historically dominant populations who are not reproducing themselves. And this is true. It's very important that the demographic contraction is occurring in every different kind of political system, democratic, authoritarian, and democratic alike. In different systems, of course, and under different leaders, under different conditions, it's going to have different effects. So there's no mechanical relation between demographic contraction and the political consequences or political response. The response is filtered through the kind of system, the kind of leaders, and the sort of ideological frame. Anyway, across the globe, societies are beginning to both age and contract. Now, taken together, the first four fears create an atmosphere, a pervasive sense that the future is uncertain, that the future is unstable, that the future is potentially hostile to human well-being. They erode confidence in the future itself, and not merely it's not so much or only that there's a fear that it's going to be worse, but there's a sense that it's illegible. We can't understand what it's going to be. How do you plan for such a thing? And particularly because of the velocity of the evolution of communication technology, something that's very intimate. We all have this intimate relation with the new technology of communication, and it's changing so fast that it makes it very hard to even imagine what kind of world the next generation is going to live in. By any honest measure, the first four fears, the first four dangers, are more comprehensive and more dangerous than the fifth. Climate change endangers everyone. If we don't get this right, nothing else matters, really. Nuclear war, if it's a nuclear exchange between superpowers, threatens every city. Pandemics threaten every human body. Technological disruption threatens every livelihood. Demographic decline, by contrast, threatens only the continuity of particular populations, and not even their total number of inhabitants, which can in principle be stabilized by immigration. On any rational scale of harm, replacement belongs near the bottom. And yet, and here's the puzzle, only demographic contraction has produced an electorally powerful political movement able to upend democratic life and even to threaten the survival of democracy. Climate, of course, has produced green parties, some climate obstructionism, based on the idea that it's an elite regulatory project and so on. Plus, but some regulation. Pandemic has produced some movements for reform, some reactionary anti-vax, anti-shutdown movements, and so on. Robotization has produced dock workers' strikes, and artificial intelligence has produced moral concern. Okay, none of these has produced what the fear of demographic replacement has produced across a generation in a dozen countries and the most diverse electoral systems, a coherent and durable politics of grievance and retribution. There's no AfD of climate change. There's no Fidesz of pandemic response. There's no national rally of artificial intelligence. The MAGA coalition, Fratelli d'Italia, Rassemblement National, the Swedish Democrats, the Party of Freedom, Reform UK, Vox, these are not local accidents. They're a political form of a continental fear. Now, I would like to know more about South Korea, but it seems to be really an extremely important case. It has the lowest peacetime fertility ever recorded, 0.72, and in Seoul, it's like 0.55. It's a country with no immigration, really, no Christian-Muslim quarrel, no post-colonial inheritance, and yet it has a similar kind of politically turbulent effect. and particularly this very strong gendered conflict. Anti-feminist election, the last election was, and a huge 30-point gender gap among voters. The fact is that it's there too shows that the local conditions, the European conditions, are responsive to something that's a larger force. The standard explanation for the disproportionate capacity of demographic panic to upend democratic politics is its everyday salience. Demographic change, let's say, rather than climate and so on, is more legible in ordinary life than the other fears. One sees it in the street, one sees it in the schoolyard, in the bakery, in the names called out at the local football game. Whereas climate change, pandemic risk, technological disruption register, they seem remote, they seem statistical, and they seem abstract. And this does explain the visibility of the threat. But it doesn't explain the intensity. Why demographic anxiety is even more conspiratorial in its cognitive shape, more resistant to ordinary argument, more productive of rage that finds no constructive outlet than the other fears. The difference lies in this. The first four fears threaten humanity. The fifth one threatens identity. Nuclear war between superpowers does not select its dead by ethnicity. The pandemic does not single out a particular line of descent. The rising sea drowns the children of the populists and the immigrants alike. Artificial intelligence displaces the lawyer, regardless of ancestry and so on. None of them, however terrible, threatens to leave the world full of someone else's children. Demographic replacement does exactly this. It shows up as a kind of, or it's understood as a kind of hate crime, defined as an assault, as vandalism, arson, or murder that's motivated in whole or in part by the offender's bias against a victim's perceived membership in a group. It's alone in combining the wound of disappearance with the indignity of substitution, captured with brutal clarity in a line that circulated in 2017 when Iowa Congressman Steve King, and he was speaking in support of Geert Wilders. And he said this: "We can't restore our civilization with somebody else's babies." Demographic contraction among historically dominant populations does not threaten to leave the world empty. It threatens to leave the world full of other people, speaking other languages, carrying other histories, inhabiting the place of yours that no longer exists. Now, there have been, this isn't the first time, there actually have been in the past real cases of great replacement. I know this because I live in one of those countries where the original population really was replaced. A more recent example, I visited when I was, as Dan mentioned, I was at the Wissenschaftskolleg in 1991, and I went with a friend of mine to Kaliningrad. And, this is a city which had It had existed under both Hitler and then Stalin. It probably is the modern European city that has been most changed since Constantinople became Istanbul. So it was a place where you had an enormous revolutionary change. And when we were touring the city, a young architect named Yuri Zabuga, who had actually created the base for the new statue of Kant. The old statue of Kant had been melted down for bullets, I think. And Marian von Dönhoff had replaced the statue, and he had organized, and he took us around the city. And he said, "There's a place you got to see. It's in the center of town." There was no center in Kaliningrad. It was a very disorderly place. And we walked into this wooded area, and there were huge gashes in the ground, a meter wide, 3 meters long. And this was, of course, a pre-war German cemetery. And every night, Russians came with flashlights and pliers and scissors and shovels, and they were robbing the German graves and pulling out gold teeth and taking necklaces and so on. This is a memory that has really stayed with me because there's something about it. Even though I'm a very secular person, I felt this was a kind of desacralization of some way. Now, in Russia, if you do that in a Kladbische, in a German cemetery, in a Russian cemetery, you go to prison. That would be a crime. No one ever was punished for this because these were other other people's babies. These were other people's ancestors. That was a society in which there was a real replacement. And I think it's good to keep that in mind when you're talking about this theory, this fantasy, this hallucination of a replacement, because it isn't that. Anyway, in the world we're talking about now, where the great replacement theory is actually flourishing, what we see is the belief that we are disappearing and a belief that someone else is going to take our place, where there is a fear of extinction in which you can blame somebody else for organizing this extinction. There's those who are substituting for us, those who are replacing us, and those who are organizing the replacement. And you have a guess, you can guess who those are. I mean, this was the ideology. Basic, one of the big campaigns of Viktor Orbán was to blame, of course, George Soros for bringing in Muslims to destroy Hungarian culture. This is what gives the fear its specific political combustion, or gives it a fuel that allows extreme populist politicians to use it to mobilize support. And it's why, in a world already saturated with many anxieties about the future, this particular fear finds such ready fuel. But how do we understand why disappearance and substitution can carry the specific emotional and political weight they do? Now, I'm going to give like two speculative, let's say, ways of thinking about the emotional resonance and political power of the great replacement hallucination. I'm not defending it, obviously. I'm just trying to explain it. First, this is kind of almost political theology, I guess. Modern liberal Enlightenment morality rests on a very radical claim, which is that all value lies in individual human beings, not in the groups into which they were accidentally born. Each person is endowed with rights by virtue of their humanity, not by their lineage, religion, nation, or tribe. And the most important implication in the current context of this point of view is that a woman without children is no less socially or morally complete or valuable than a woman with children. The childless are not failed members of society who are failing to produce the next generation. They're simply individuals among others. This is not a traditional idea. This is a radical idea. You could open the Hebrew Bible. What do you find? The greatest blessing is to be fruitful. The greatest curse is to be sterile. The promise to Abraham is to have descendants as numerous as the stars. The covenant is not between God and an individual, but between God and a line, a lineage. Even more remarkable, in the Bible, there is a power greater than God. What is that power? It's a reason to obey God. If there's a power it's that he's the God of your fathers. That is the fundamental way in which obedience itself is grounded on the fact that the deity is an inheritance. It's rooted, all of this is rooted in the central and painful fact about human condition, which is that everyone we love will die and disappear. And in order to escape this condition, we imaginatively escape from this common house of impermanence, which we all inhabit. We invest emotionally in the continuity of generations from ancestors to descendants. By relocating the center of human value from the chain to the individual, Enlightenment liberalism dissolves the moral certainty and the moral centrality, of the distinction between members and non-members of a group into which each person was accidentally born. So if you read the diatribes of the political theorists, and there are many in the US, and I'm sure here too, who try to justify a great replacement doctrine, that's really their main point. Their main charge against the Enlightenment is that it takes away the chance for people to imaginatively live beyond their momentary time. It is the common way to talk about this is it has loosed the YOLO generation, you only live once generation, who don't care about having kids, who aren't committing to the future. They're just saying, well, why have children? We got to live now for ourselves now, because there is only now. This explains why the anti-liberal tradition will never disappear, why it's a permanent thing. And it also explains why the liberal populist conflict what the liberal populist conflict, I think, is really actually about. This is more democratic theory now. Both sides, in a conflict between mainstream parties and populist parties, believe in majority rule. So both sides are democratic. The thing is, they define the majority differently. And that's the main structure of the way populist parties interact with mainstream parties. They're divided over the question of how much ethnos you need to make a demos, how much consanguinity is required for a people, democratic people, to be a people. Liberals will defend the electoral majority. It's physically represented by the multi-ethnic voting line. In America, you can see the voting line. There are all people from all different countries and so on, the US for sure. While populists defend the historical majority. So you have an electoral majority versus, both sides are democratic in their own interpretation. Tucker Carlson speaks of legacy Americans, those who, in his phrase, whose ancestors lived here, were white, were Christian, of European descent, the country's founding stock. They were part of the country's stock. And immigration then is not about labor markets. It's about civilizational substitution and erasure. Erasure of legacy Americans by newcomers and outsiders. Now, I think you have to get to show how this idea plays out, at least in American politics, I need to kind of quickly define democracy. So what is democracy? Democracy is a system of competitive overpromising, which necessarily produces disappointment, and then manages that disappointment by leaving over the possibility that the incumbents who disappoint you can be replaced in the next election. And that those who are disappointed, who will always be a large number of people, by whoever is elected, instead of channeling their discontent into extra parliamentary violence, will channel it into preparing for the next election. So you manage society, you manage discontent by having an open future in which people are able to believe that in the next election they will have a chance to take power. And this, by the way, it's important, I think, theoretically to say, in this sense, democracy is more basic than liberalism, because democracy allows you to manage discontent without repression. Democracy allows you to manage discontent by channeling the frustration of those who don't like the government inside the system. If you don't have that safety valve, you have to rule by repression necessarily. So destroying democracy is a road to civil war, or road to violence, let's put it that way. Trump's claim, and this is what I'm getting to, Trump claimed over and over again, and he keeps claiming, that he cannot lose a fair election, that any defeat, if he was ever defeated, it would be by definition fraudulent. Now that sounds like a narcissistic refusal of reality or a legal strategy and so on, but it's something deeper. It's an attack on this thing I just mentioned, on the very mechanism that allows democracy to contain conflict without violence. So why do voters vote for a candidate who promises to destroy the very point of voting? Why do Trump supporters willingly repeat his absurd and politically pointless claim that he won the 2020 election? Well, they talk about miscounted votes. They talk about defective machines. But the political energy in this movement, in this denial movement, doesn't come from a belief in software glitches. It comes from something deeper. It comes from the conviction that the electorate itself has been illegitimately constituted. The wrong people have been counted. There are other countries in which we might see how that works too. In 2021, an American union official trying to explain its members' loyalty to Trump said, "The democratically elected president of white America." Trump is the democratically elected, and he is. White Americans did vote for Trump. If you excluded non-whites, he would be president. That phrase, I think, captures the logic with the unusual clarity that what we take as the big lie is, of course, a lie, but it's experienced as metaphorically or even metaphysically true by belief of those who think that the wrong nation got to vote. Now I'm going to turn briefly to a second divide. There's the divide between the historical majority and the electoral majority. A second one, more briefly, not between two majorities, but between the way two different groups experience time differently. This is the way political polarization tracks not divisions according to class so much as differences according to the way people experience time. This is a cleavage which explains the anti-establishment, anti-elitist ethos of populism. I think it's Alexander Golan, is that his name? He has a great phrase, which I like. He says, the globalist is the person who, when it rains in his country, doesn't get wet. So there's a sense that there are those guys who are protected in some way, and they're not like us. They can put their kids in schools where everyone speaks German. We can't do that, and so on. This is people who have certain kinds of, they have monopolized the exit ramps and the lifeboats and the privileges. I don't think it probably is an accurate representation of what was meant in the German discussion as the simultaneity of the non-simultaneous. I had thought that this was an idea that was invented by Ernst Bloch, but I learned before the session that it has an older history. In any case, what I'm going to use the idea that there are two populations who live together but have a different experience of time. And these are the college educated and their children, and they have some chance of having a desirable future. And those without a college degree who in the knowledge economy, in the new knowledge economy, have very little sense of prospects for their future. There's an older definition. Edward Shills at Chicago defined populism as hostility to the overeducated. I'll get back to that in a second. But there is this hostility according to your college degree that has to do with your opportunities in the future. The democratic promise that sacrifice today will bring reward tomorrow no longer holds for a big part of the electorate. In the shadow of this sense of betrayal, the promise of a populist politician takes hold. And what is that promise? It's not a promise to give you your future. It's a promise to be your retribution. I'm not going to provide you with anything that's good for you, but what I'm going to do is destroy the future of those who've taken your future away. And it's really hard to understand the animus of destruction of Harvard University and other elite institutions, except it's a desire. It doesn't give anything to his own voters, but it takes away something from those who are seen to be guilty somehow of their loss. It doesn't offer construction, it offers demolition. The demolition is easier, of course. It requires no long-term planning. That was a very funny thing. The head of building in Washington, appointed by Trump, he was confronted with the fact that there are rules and laws that say you can't build on a national site without permission. And he said, yes, it's true. You can't build the ballroom without permission, but you can destroy the East Wing without permission. So destruction is something you're free to do. And I think that is, if you ask, what does the ballroom give MAGA voters? What do they get out of that? I think it's very hard to understand what it could be. But the destruction of something that makes the rest of us go crazy, that is something that they can consume. Now, the destructiveness, again, you have to ask, why are people voting for a politician who is so destructive? And if you list what Trump has done in the second administration, it is a cascade of destruction. Besides attacking the universities and attacking scientific research and attacking ballooning the national debt and destroying the IRS and purging experienced personnel from all the bureaucracies, including national security bureaucracies, taking apart climate mitigation, just the weather forecasters are being fired. All programs for helping grade school and high school teachers prepare abolished, inspector generals fired, and so on, making it impossible for NATO allies to trust the U.S., abandoning the last nuclear arms treaty, starting $1 billion a day war with no planning, and so on. Why do voters vote for someone who is conducting a war against the future of the country? Well, the only reason that makes any sense at all to me is that they think what he's destroying is someone else's future, the future of a group that's being painted as guilty, and is painted as having taken away their future. Now, I want to just say a word here. I'm getting to it at the end about Russia's war in Ukraine, because I think it is important that the parallel between Russia's incredibly destructive war in Ukraine, you realize, and his willingness to accept the staggering losses of his own troops, and of course the deaths of Ukraine. What's behind that? And it's amazing how much of it is driven by demographic panic. In the years really before the war began, Putin spoke constantly about the great crime in Russian history was that Russia was destined to have a population of 500 million by the year 2001. And this was prevented by the fall of the revolution, World War I, the revolution, the Second World War, and so on, and then by the fall of communism. And all of the programs, he had one natalist program after another, trying to increase the Russian population, got rewards. None of them worked. Putin's only policy that had any effect on increasing the Slavic population of the Russian Federation was the annexation of Crimea in 2014, which added about 2 million Slavs to the population. And that was on his mind. And in the great paper he wrote on the unity of Russian and Ukrainian people in the summer before the invasion, he said this: Ukrainians are really Russians. We are one people. We have to add them. This was a war it was not a war for territory, of course not. And in Soviet history, and he wasn't recreating the Soviet Union. That's such a false way to understand it. The Soviet Union never grew in order to take in ethnic Russians. This was a war trying to increase the ethnic Russian population of Russia. And it was a war for people of a certain kind who he described over and over again as on the verge of distinction. When he would talk to school children, he would compare the Russian people to the dinosaurs and said they may become extinct. And there's a meteorite headed for all of you, he would say, and that meteorite is Western liberalism, particularly feminism and gay rights and so on. It was the same language. Feminism is guilty. Liberalism is guilty for destroying our society. Unlike the populists in Europe are afraid of immigrants coming in. And Putin's fear was of Ukrainians going out. It was as if they're going to engage in an exogamous marriage. They're going to marry the West. They're going to leave us. And the violence. And in order, just like Trump wants to destroy Harvard University in a much more violent way in this case, he said to the Ukrainians, you're Russians. If you don't admit it, I'm going to destroy you. And the war, of course, began with the hope that it would be easy. But then it didn't. And the deaths are astronomical. More than 200,000 Russians died. 1 million young people in reproduction age have left the country. Amazingly self-destructive. And the only positive, the only gain is that he's destroying Ukraine's future too. Okay, there's this punitive, almost nihilistic element in both cases. In Europe, you can see the nihilism in the idea that there are competing suicide pacts. In other words, if we don't let immigrants in, our economy is going to collapse and the pension system is going to collapse. And if we do let them in, our civilization is going to collapse. So basically, you're describing the problem as insoluble. Finally, the demographic panic I've been describing shows up in many forms, as I've said: European and American anti-immigrant politics, Putin's war in Ukraine, a war meant to replenish the population has accelerated its loss. It's a single condition in various forms. And we have to admit that liberal democratic parties, however, and this is a way to say mainstream parties and our own system has not done a great job at handling or managing or knowing how to deal successfully with these populist insurgencies. We're all hoping that Peter Magyar is going to start a trend. But as what we know so far is that the Liberal Party, the mainstream parties, let's put democratic parties, they can sometimes ease material inequality, but they have a very hard time, and in fact, they can't do something. They can't satisfy the populist demand for a permanent recognition of a historical majority. That the conflict is not going to go away. That's something you cannot do within the context of modern liberal democratic politics. What liberalism can do, while refusing the seduction of retributory politics, is to force a harder kind of honesty about ourselves. To many populists, our universalism, universalism is the particularism of the well-educated, is what we like to say. In the sense that all of us, we're perfectly willing to hang around with people who would have different passports and different ethnicities, as long as you've read the same movies or go to the same museums or attend the American Academy and so on. And then we denounce people who aren't that well educated for wanting to hang around with people like themselves. And that's viewed, now you don't have to accept that view of us. On the other hand, you can see why it's seen as a kind of hypocrisy. So we're not going to resolve the deeper disagreement between ourselves and populists, but we should learn how to see how we appear from the outside, and at a minimum, we should try to achieve the self-awareness about what I just said, a self-awareness that can help us endure this conflict, which is going to keep going on, without mistaking our own blind spots for moral clarity. I'm going to go up there. If you, maybe here, I can hold it. You want me to sit? Yeah, I think I can do it. Whoops.
Oh, very good. All right, great. So I'm going to sit over here. That's okay.
Yeah, that's best.
Okay, well, I knew I was right when I had that free song about your application and all that it meant for the class. Anyway, thank you for a terrific talk. It's hard to imagine a better place to give it than Berlin. I was reminded as you were speaking of a book that came out in 1990 that was titled, I believe, Kopfgebet, Die Deutschen sterben aus, by none other than Günter Grass. Demographics have been a hugely neuralgic issue in Germany for a long, long time. The same in Japan for a long, long time. The Korean case is really quite remarkable. It's just been bouncing downward for decades. And so I want to challenge you to begin with by asking you to disaggregate, okay? Populations have been declining in reproduction's been declining. Populations have been declining in the West for a long, long time. But what seems to have caused the crisis was the influx of large populations of migrants. The AfD wasn't going anywhere until 2015, and the enormous influx of Syrians, Afghans, and others. This is not to blame the migrants for what happened. And in fact, I think you and I would probably agree that the U.S. bears a lot of responsibility for the civilization erasure that it complains about, because after all, if we hadn't gone into Iraq and given the possibility of created the possibility of a civil war there, we wouldn't have upended the whole region and caused for this mass migration. And watching Iran, I'm very fearful of the next mass migration. But the question really is it so much about falling birth rates, or is it about the sense of untrammeled immigration?
Is this on? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Of course, there are virulent populist movements in Hungary where there's no immigration. There's no immigration in Korea. There's no immigration in Poland. I mean, so it's independent. It seems to be there's an independent causality there. But of course, particularly when mass immigration occurs and you're having a a demographic contraction at the same time, this becomes a neuralgic connection. And I see that definitely. It seems to me that what would be maybe a tendency to for right-wing parties to flourish in a context like, say, East Germany, which the East Germans were like the Soviets in the following sense that they didn't just they also lost their country. So I think the one thing is when you see others, the world is changing around you. The world you grew up in is no longer the same. There's an elite. This is also part of the perspective that is instituting social norms, particularly gendered norms that you didn't grow up with and you feel are alien to you. Those are the background factors. If it were only occurring in countries that had a huge migration like Germany, then I would say that's the main point. Now, of course, what's interesting is that it's happening so many places under different conditions. And one other thing I want to discuss here, because it's a complicated story, but there is a view that the problem is the immigrants aren't being integrated. But we know from history that often the greatest resentment is against groups who are assimilated. That is, groups who, and goes back to a sense of trauma that's connected with this with national identity. So one fundamental mythical belief is that the culture, let's say the German culture, the culture you have and you live in is somehow a symbol of the consanguineous relation between ancestors and descendants. And actually, it turns out if foreigners come in and become perfectly German, that's more of a threat. That is as much of a threat to you as the unassimilated, because it's breaking down your belief that what makes you you is your position in an ancestral line. So anyway, that makes it somewhat more complicated. It's an immensely difficult issue, and I think the fact that it happens in countries without immigration at all means, who of course maybe they're aware that it's happening elsewhere, but they are also these are the countries like Hungary is depopulating, and often they can't. If you talk directly about how everyone is leaving, it sounds like you're panicking and you've got a country that no one wants to be in, which could be also true. So you blame others. So there are narratives of blame that are fictional, but are also self-exculpating. I think that has something to do with anti-immigrant talk in countries with no immigrants.
Well, I think you're certainly right to underscore the weirdness of resentment and hate. Study after study has shown that the greatest xenophobia is in parts of America that have no immigrants. We have whole countries that have flourishing cultures of anti-Semitism that have no Jews. You can go on and on. It's a wonderful world. I mean, it's just great the way those things develop. So I was interested that you didn't, and maybe it was just because you were being considerate about time, talk about the intellectual or further intellectual deformations that have come with all this. And I'm thinking in particular about the vice presidents basically, tossing overboard, 86ing, if you will, if we can use that current metaphor.
Well, you better watch out.
Yeah, I could be on the most wanted list soon of, an understanding of what America was that Ronald Reagan embraced, that it's an idea. It's not the color of your skin. It's not where you're from. It's not when you arrived. It's an idea. It's an idea of a constitution. It's an idea of how we govern ourselves. And he was saying, no, it's that our ancestors, were fighting, at Trenton or wherever, or at Gettysburg and so on and so forth. And I'm curious, do you see that getting traction? It seems to me to be so fundamentally un-American that I think anyone who's ever gone through a naturalization process would debate it, and lots of other Americans would too.
Well, of course, it's futile. One of the things that Trump hated most about Obama was Obama's claim that we can be a multiracial democracy and still be America. As Trump thinks this is a horrible idea. And of course, we are a multiracial democracy, and so the alternative is violence. So it's a kind of a crazy thing to attack. Traction. I mean, one of the weird questions on American populism, if you put it that way, anti-liberal, anti-elite, anti-university culture, is that it combines MAGA with Silicon Valley, and particularly the Silicon Valley, with strong relations with South Africa. So there is that kind of weird, strange connection, which I don't know how deep does it go. And Vance is such a chameleon, but I do think it is important to.
And we're a nonpartisan institution, by the way, just so you all remember.
Republicans are. I have some of my. No, I can't say that anymore. Some of my best friends are Republicans. No, sorry. But yeah, I want to say a word about this because we're coming up on the 250th, which is going to be of the anniversary of the Declaration and so on. But there is a way in which these people, and Vance, when he talks about, and Tucker Carlson and so on, they're not completely un-American, because after all, there were 3 races in America at the time of the founding, and only one of them, only whites could be parts of the political community at the founding. Now, America was very open to immigration. That was the greatness of the country and how it developed, but it wasn't open to immigration because all men are created equal. It was open to immigration because white was such an elastic category, which allowed people to come. And that elasticity eventually, and you see this in Lincoln and very Germans and so on, were welcoming others to come to the country. It's then really with the Civil Rights Movement that and of course later on in the Chinese Exclusion Act. This is a long story, but the point is, the idea that, of inclusion today has developed over our history, and the idea of going back to the time of George Washington and defining the members of the community under those conditions, that's absurd. That can only be violence. So why would you be asking for something that you cannot have? And if you ask, what is the world? What world does MAGA want? What is the picture of America that would be ideal for them? It would be all white, all Christian, immigrants, minorities, marginalized, undocumented exiled, women in the home. This can't happen. So they're wanting something that cannot be. And the consequence is that they're then satisfied with the politics that is essentially destructive, destroying institutions, because they can't really build something they want. So I think that's the problem. First, it's odious on its own terms, but it's also, it leads only to destruction because it's a goal that cannot possibly be reached.
On that cheerful note, let's open it up for questions. I see a hand back there. I can't see. Is that you, Adam? You always get the first question. How does this happen?
Quick with this hand.
Go ahead. No, it's fine.
Stephen, thanks very much. So I'm wondering, because at one point you did start to talk about economics, and it strikes me that the story about opportunity and future, a lot of people put this on the hollowing out of American manufacturing in the 70s, and that attacking the elites' instruments of mobility and getting from the 1% to the 0.1%. But if we still had an economy where people could think they were going to move into the middle class and all of these other things, how much of this would drain away?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so the factors that make people sensitive also, I'm sure in Germany, is a question of how many jobs there are. And if you have an economy that's booming and racing and there's jobs for everyone. We all know the statistic. I think in 1990, right, at least 50% of Americans said that they were better off than their parents. And in 2010, it's like 10% or something. So there's clearly democracy itself is subsidized by a feeling that the economy is growing and that that the world is getting better. And this varies with economic change. And particularly now, because of robotization and AI, we're in a position where it could be a serious problem. We don't really know; it hasn't played itself out. But that's another factor that obviously is going to affect people's willingness to plan for the future or ability to plan for the future. So, the economic factors would never. The point is that there are multiple causes, but I think there's a hysteria involved in the idea that I am going to be the last Bulgarian. You know, there's a very good chance that in whatever 100 years there will be no. My colleague is Bulgarian.
Yeah, okay.
I use his. I'm sympathizing with him. That in 100 years no one will speak the language. I mean, you can have languages do go extinct. Cultural groups do go extinct. I live in Italy in the summers. I have a house in the winter, and on Saturday evening, and Italians are not racist, but on Saturday evening there are no Italians in the grocery store. On Saturday evening at the trains between Pisa and Florence, there are no Italians. And it disturbs them. This is not just an economic factor if they had more jobs and so on. So there is something about this fear of disappearing, of being replaced. It's an existential fear that, like Kaliningrad, there'll be no one there, that your whole civilization will. I'm just astonished at how Putin just speaks constantly about civilizational erasure. And in our national security strategy, why is that there? Civilizational erasure. This is what's happening to Europe. Now, these are wild exaggerations, but it touches on something that isn't just about employment.
By the way, just a curious factoid in all this is the extent to which really large families have become really popular among the ultra rich. Have you noticed that? Do you want to expound on that one, or is it self-explanatory?
I was surprised. Van der Laan has 7 kids. I noticed that. Amazing.
Well, Elon Musk has like 13.
Yeah, well, that's a different thing. But he doesn't even know who his kids are, what their names are, or they're named X1 or something. Yeah. No, it's not.
Yeah, that may be okay. Well, reproduction rates are very high among the ultra wealthy.
Yeah, it's true.
Okay.
But I mean, it is a problem. It's costly. I mean, it's obviously, and the sense of, yes, this is. I mean, of all many factors, but I think those guys. I feel like the idea that if you have like 50 kids, you're going to really care about the next generation. I'm not so sure. And one of the things about the Silicon Valley, unlike this general picture I was giving, which is a sense that very hard to have an attitude toward the future that as a positive attitude. Those guys have a picture of the future. It's kind of a science fiction future, and it's privatized. It's just for them. And most human beings are superfluous to them. They don't need them. They'll be useless. You don't need to go to, again, attacking Harvard University. You don't need to go to college, Peter Thiel. You don't need to even have medical researchers because AI is going to do all of it for us and so on. So there's a kind of common attack on the establishment, the old establishment, that is compatible with a kind of futuristic science fiction view of the privatized future.
Yeah. Okay. I'm standing so that so they can see.
Go ahead, Paula.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for your picture. I want to ask you 2 things about your picture. So the bad picture, apocalyptic, is something that is really disturbing for democracy because I don't see much proposals or alternatives coming from the democratic point of view. But if you look at the satisfaction of the far right, especially the young people, they are really very happy about the possibility to build the future differently. And they are feeling they are doing something. So they can wait a little bit, but it will happen. So that's something that seems to me to add to your picture, and it explains why you have so many people now pro-life and anti-feminist politics, because you can do your babies yourself, like the AfD used to say. So the new Germans, we are doing them. We are making our own Germans. We are not importing them. But it doesn't work without racism. And I would like to hear about your assumptions about culture, also taking into picture racism. How does it plays out? And the second question is, do we have a positive picture for the future in this apocalyptic idea?
I'm not recognizing I haven't seen anything similar to what you're telling me, which is really a picture of the future they think they're building. And certainly I don't see it in the United States, what world they think they're creating. A lot of them want to go back. It's like, in the, under communism, the Soviet Union, you had to sacrifice today for a very strong picture of the end of alienation. There was a kind of inequality and so on, justice. Um, uh, and is there really a huge population boom among right-wing voters in Germany? I'd be surprised. Race is, of course, obviously a huge issue here because of somehow it's the form in the United States that really for someone like Trump, his father got in trouble with the law because he had a apartment complex which was at a restrictive covenant. Basically no blacks could get apartments in the housing. And I think he really wants to turn the whole country into kind of restricted covenant thing. And it's not so much about Mexicans. It's really a residual thing about this antagonism to Black Americans, which he then transfers to this idea of the immigrants are coming and tainting our blood or whatever he's saying. And it's also, it is important for one of the limits of liberalism, I would put it, or what I'm using the word liberalism in an American sense. And this is the following, that America has never been a completely liberal country because of the importance of racism. And racism is, of course, a totally anti-individualistic way of thinking. You see somebody, you just think of their race. And in fact, you can understand why minority groups in the United States, for example, policemen do not shoot white teenagers in the head for having a broken tail light on their car. And if you say to members of the Black community, well, you're all being treated as individuals by the police, they're not going to believe you. They are being treated as members of a group. They are being treated not as individuals. That's a limit. That's not the doctrine. That's not the ideology, but it is the emotional consequence of a deeply a culture has been suffused with racial hierarchy since the beginning. And therefore, that it means that a liberal way of approaching society, which is about individual rights and individual opportunity and so on, doesn't speak to groups who are mistreated because of their membership, even though, of course, they shouldn't be. And the ideal is that they shouldn't be. And we're complaining about the fact that they're not. Nonetheless, that's not their experience of the world. And so the very language of individualism doesn't speak to members of the community who've been treated only as members of group. And that's a difficulty that Enlightenment individualism has in managing a society like America's.
Thanks for this wonderful talk. But I wonder whether there are really some market differences also between the situation you described in the United States and in various European countries. And I think one common or one denominator for this is religion. In the United States, I fully understand that populists are destructive because essentially they are against something they can't really change. In Europe, Hungary, for example, and also Germany, I think the fear is not so much of migration, but it is the fear of migrants with a Muslim background that are likely to change all the values of our understanding of democracy that root in Christian and Jewish traditions, and that therefore I think migrants they come, for example, from Christian backgrounds, would have no problem coming to these countries.
Yeah, I mean, I think there have been 250,000 even in the last year in Spain from Latin America, and they seem to have got along perfectly fine. But I think it's important. Of course, I've read Houellebecq, so I know the problem that you're talking about, certainly in the French case. But it is watching Peter Magyar right now, he's doing great things, but he's very careful not to push too strong on the gender stories. So the gender thing is also, remember, Orbán, when he abolished the gender studies program at Central European University, he did it because he said they are teaching girls not to have babies. So this is a different issue than the Muslim issue. In Korea, that's why I think the South Korean case is so important, because it has similarities to European countries. There are no Muslims. This is not a Christian-Muslim problem. So there is something about the demographic fear, a shrinking population disappearing, that is independent of whether or not you're being invaded or taken over, or the reverse conquista, I guess. But so I know, obviously this is different. America has a South American immigration, but it has a lot of the same qualities and the same language. And I do think it's important that at least Trump's language about Mexicans is similar to Hitlerian language about Jews. It's like they're vermin, they're like bugs, they're blood, and so on. So there's something about this vocabulary which doesn't necessarily touch on the issue of Islam. I mean, I spend a lot of time in France, and the French has a huge Muslim population, and of course it's a strain on the system.
The Hungarians, it clearly is, and the Magyar is not going to change the anti-migrant policy because of the history of Hungary. It was occupied for over 100 years by the Turks, and they're still traumatized by it.
And they still have the baths, the Turkish baths. Thank you.
Over here.
These lights.
Hello, thank you for the talk. I would just like to challenge again this question if the dominant variable is really the decline in demographics, because I'm wondering what your understanding is of civilization. I think your argument only works if you put civilization and nation state as the same variable. And that is the variable of the far right. And if you have a different definition of civilization, I'm still wondering if your argument holds. And secondly, if this is a threat to democracy, then the best advice would be that we would have to make more children to defend democracy. And I'm not so sure if that would be the best advice, because that would be the consequence out of that strong variable.
Yeah. So what the concept of civilization, as I think the far right uses it, is something that's very national, that's connected with a single ethnicity. It's a single language group. I mean, I understand. At dinner, I learned that many of less advantaged Germans are sending their kids to school where 80%, is that right, of the other kids do not speak German or something like that. And that would be a sense that there's something happening in our educational system which is threatening a particular civilizational tradition which is connected to the language. But you're saying you have a definition of civilization that doesn't involve a single language? Is that right? You mean Christianity or what?
Your definition of civilization.
Well, I think my definition, we're talking about what is threatened. When Putin says Russian civilization is dying, he means a certain kind of historical, he's fantasizing, of course, and civilization as the real culture and changes over time, and it's Russia in the medieval times and Russia today have really nothing to do with each other. But there's a fantasy, and you can see that. Is Jewish tradition today the same as it was many thousands of years ago? Of course, it's not. But there's a kind of belief that there's a lineage that it holds together, and it's somehow a continuity. And this is it's a great form of hubris to believe this. But it's consoling to people who want to feel they belong to something that lasts. So individuals are real. Groups are just in your head, they're just ideas, including civilization. It's an idea, you have it, it's a label. And it has experiential meaning to people, but there's no, as you know, definitions can't be true or false. So my definition of civilization is irrelevant. It's just how the word is used in different contexts. And the way it's used by far-right parties is it's something threatened. And it's threatened by people who don't share the idiom. And it's threatened by people who don't have the same ancestors. And a lot of this is fantasy, because probably those who are labeled as outsiders probably have the same DNA as the people who are insiders. So it's not it's a way of seeing a threat, and a threat to, well, what is it a threat to? It's a threat to this sense of continuity over time, which is such a precious story that people love to tell themselves.
I think we have time for one more. Here, Marilyn. Oh, I'm sorry. Please.
Yeah, thank you for this wonderful full talk. And there's no doubt that demography is such a big issue in this populist, right-wing populist movement, and very resonates very much in the population. I have 2 points. First, you suggested a bit that it's a global trend. I'm not so sure. Most of the time we talk about the West and post-communist Eastern Europe. And for both, it for sure matters. But shouldn't we dismantle a bit more the drivers of this? Because I think there are huge differences. For the US, and also for Western Europe, the decline of the middle class or the stagnation of middle class, of course, matters to some extent for this kind of outcome. For Eastern Europe, there are other reasons. And we have also this problem of, as you mentioned, it's good to mention civilization as a part of it. Yeah, we see also in the West a return of a civilization discourse, at the same time dismantling transnational, transatlantic, and liberal institutions. Yeah, so I'm not so sure if we really can paint such a broad picture without differentiating a bit more the drivers. You talked several times about Russia. I'm unfortunately an expert on Russia, so the demography matters for Ukraine for sure, but also that Russia is seeing it as a declining great power and want to get back its position, like the US now. So geopolitics matters. Yeah, so I'm not so sure if the drivers are all the same for the same result. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously. So, I mean, it's obviously there are other factors. I certainly didn't say there was no other factors. But I do think this is a particularly virulent one, which seems to be weirdly shared in a lot of countries where there are disturbances. So although it is a almost universal trend, including in China. I mean, you saw recently that they keep putting very high taxes on condoms, and doesn't matter. Kids will pay as much as you charge for them. They can't deal with the fact that the population is dropping, and it's a big problem for aging societies and so forth. So this is and of course Japan we know. So I obviously many other factors, and I couldn't quite understand if you were saying I didn't account for all the factors that lead to demographic shrinkage, or I couldn't account for all the factors that lead to political turbulence. And I would admit to both of those. So that's fine.
All right. Well, what that means is we have a lot more to discuss. And some of that will even get discussed here at the American Academy. First of all, I want to thank Stephen for a terrific and very provocative talk.